In this last of the talks with you, I want to focus on the Jewish future in America. Now, there is a difference between being Jewish, which involves an awful lot more than just the Jewish religion. But we're going to pick three issues that are salient to the Jews. However, I want to start with a disclaimer in a way. And the disclaimer is in the form of a quotation that is allegedly from Confucius, halfway around the world. Apparently, Confucius said something like, "Prophecy is a very difficult art, especially when it's applied to the future." Well, we're going to talk about the future. And the first thing I want to talk about is Jewish demography. That is, the population of Jews in the United States. The Jewish birth rate in America is under replacement numbers, except, of course, for some very Orthodox groups, the Hasidic groups particularly, where they will have large families. But most liberal Jews, and even many Orthodox Jews, have about 2 children. It takes 2.3 kids in a family to mathematically reproduce a population. Because, of course, there are some people who have 1 and some people who have none. So 2.3 is about the average. We have about 2. And so there are many reasons for this. One of them is later marriages. More and more Jews are attending university and then graduate school and defer their marriage or at least having children until somewhat later in life. Another cause is the increasing number of people who are deciding not to have any children at all or to limit their family to 1 or 2 kids. Part of that, of course, is economic, because it is so expensive to send your children to the university today. A private university costs in the neighborhood of $75,000 a year, and there are not very many families that can afford that. So I think we can conclude that the number of Jews in the United States will decrease over the next decades. Presently, we estimate that there are somewhere between 6.5 and 7 million Jews in America. How many there will be in the future is up for grabs, in a sense. It's uncertain. It certainly depends on who's doing the counting, who is considered a Jew, and how many kids they have. Is it always, according to the Jewish traditional law, that a child of a Jewish mother alone is a Jew? Or is it the child of a Jewish father as well? That's called patrilineal descent. Or is it a person who decides to become Jewish? Now, these are problems that are not unique to Jews. They generally flow from socioeconomic status. Middle class and upper middle class people rarely have more than 2 or 3 kids. Once in a while, 4. But it is clear that the Jewish population is likely to decline in America. Back in 1999, Alan Dershowitz from Harvard University published a book called The Vanishing American Jew. And that was a book that predicted, long before the actual numbers were available, that this is going to happen. It depends a little bit on who's counting and how people count. But the consequences are generally unavoidable. Now, what are the consequences? Well, as the population ages, there will be fewer young people to pick up the slack and to put in money into the community to pay for the increased number of needs that an older population has. There will be needs for more medical care, needs for more housing for senior citizens, more people in caregiving roles. And this is accentuated by the decline of independent Jewish business. It used to be that if you went to virtually any small town, around the center square in town you could find a number of stores, and some of them were owned by Jews. You had Cohen's Haberdashery, or Goldberg's women's wear, or things like that. Now most Jews are choosing to enter professions, and the downtown area of most cities has fallen into disuse. There are very few young Jews who are taking up independent business in the same way. Now, why is that important? Because businessmen tend to have more discretionary income, and they are often the ones who are able to make charitable contributions, the kind of contributions that are needed to provide the services for an aging population. So there's a stress in fundraising and the availability of money to provide the services. Salaried professionals generally give less money than entrepreneurs. That's a rule, and it is true. Now, in smaller communities, this is particularly true. 80% of American Jews live in a very few communities, and if you look at this map, which is also on your screen, you will see that I've circled certain areas in the United States where there are large numbers of Jews. They are generally the Boston to Washington metroplex, the area around the Great Lakes, and Texas. A few other places like southern Florida and southern California. But beyond that, there are huge areas of the country that have become empty of Jews. This was not always true. In Texas, for example, in 1940, there were about 125 to 150 communities where there were between 50 and 100 Jewish people. Today there are virtually none. In the 1960s, as interstate highways bypassed downtowns and downtowns fell apart, these people moved to middle-sized cities. So they came from little towns to middle-sized towns. And then, as those towns were bypassed, they moved to bigger cities. So there is a concentration of Jews. In Texas, for example, 96% of all Jews live in 6 cities. 4% live elsewhere. The composition of the community is also becoming more homogeneous. As immigration has decreased almost to a point of non-existence, people are having the same experience as their non-Jewish neighbors. And there is a continuing assimilation of Jewish people, except for the ultra-Orthodox, so that it's often very difficult to distinguish from an analysis of lifestyle who is who in the community. And the only time that most Jews are identifiable is in their private practice of religion, either in the home or in the synagogue or something like that. Now let's turn to the religious aspect of the community. Everybody in America, even the most Orthodox, are affected by the trend of secularism. Secularism means that you make decisions based on other than religious ideals and grounds. Organized religion in America has suffered. This includes Jews, of course. Affiliation and attendance have fallen off. I used to think that Catholics, for example, were very pious and went to church. But my friend, retired Bishop Edmund Carmody of Corpus Christi, tells me that the average Sunday attendance in all of the diocese of Corpus Christi is around 15%, 15%. That's awfully low. And it's true of Jews as well as non-Jews. Jews, of course, suffer from an additional disability in that our Sabbath is often in conflict with other activities in the community. Friday night football, concerts, other activities, or just simply coming home late from work and being tired. Saturday is a day when the youth soccer league meets, or there are other things going on, and they are sometimes much more attractive than going to the synagogue for 2 or 3 hours. The other side of this secularist trend, however, is a trend about spirituality. Sometimes if you say to a person, "Are you Jewish?" they may say, "Yeah, I'm Jewish. I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual." Now, what does that mean? It means that they are searching for meaning and purpose, but it's often not within a religious context. Now, those are important things for all of us. All of us want our lives to be meaningful and significant, but the younger generation especially often will try to find this in non-traditional settings. Excuse me. More challenging for Jews are the theological questions about traditional theism and the role of God. Now, the traditional notion of God was that God intervened in human events, and in some cases controlled human events. And that idea is still very popular. God, why did you do this to me? God, thank you, God, for helping me, and so on. God, protect me. Well, in a theological conversation, Jews often will raise the question, where was God at Auschwitz? How come God didn't intervene in the time of the Holocaust in World War II? If there was ever a time for divine intervention in human events, the protection of about 11 million people who died under the Nazi concentration camp regime, that would have been a good time. And it didn't seem to happen. At least it's not so obvious. And so some people, a number of people have said, if that's not what God did, if God didn't intervene, why should we be concerned about God? What's that all about? Now, they don't have, or they haven't, looked at alternative notions of God. Some people think of God as simply the creator, a sort of a deistic concept. God started the whole process of the universe and then is not involved, has left it to human devices to figure out what to do. Or God is the source of values, the ground of being, as the Protestant theologian Paul Tillich said. There are all kinds of ways to think about God, and they may not be mutually exclusive, but the concept of God intervening in daily life is something that is a difficult proposition to maintain, and so people often don't come to synagogue because that's what they think synagogue is all about. Now, there appears to be something of a polarity in this case. On the one hand, you have liberals and secularists, and on the other hand, you have very traditional theists, and it's sort of one or the other. You can't find a really good middle ground, and so people make decisions based on that. An additional consideration is that we live in a very open society. We live in a society where Jews and non-Jews mingle easily. Jews have become much more acceptable in communal events and communal society, and sometimes they fall in love. And when they fall in love, they have to ask themselves, is there one or another of our family traditions that we're going to follow? Are we going to be Christian or Muslim or whatever, or nothing? Or are we going to be Jewish? And some of those decisions go one way and some go the other way. There is an increasing number of non-Jewish partners who are finding value in Judaism, and the number of conversions is slowly increasing. But Jews generally don't go after conversion very intensely. We generally wait for somebody to come and present himself or herself, and then we will teach that person what we are and hope that it's a helpful and meaningful interchange. But at least some of the kids of these marriages, interfaith marriages, will not be Jewish. And that means that that will be an additional drain on the number of Jews in our community and in our society. Let me take a third problem now, and that's the issue. It's not a problem really, it's an issue, and that's the issue of Israel. Before 1948, groups like the American Council for Judaism and some others actively opposed the creation of a Jewish state in the area of Palestine. But then, in May of 1948, Israel declared its independence. And that opposition generally disappeared. The pressure of the refugees from World War II and the fact that there needed to be a state, someplace where Jews could go as a matter of right, not as a matter of tolerance, that was so paramount that most people in the world said, okay, yeah, we need a state of Israel. We need a place where a Jew can go and call it home automatically. There was nearly unanimous and enthusiastic support for Israel. But then along came several different conflicts with Arab neighbors, culminating in 1967 with a rather short war, which Israel, thank goodness, survived, and survived very well. But a large amount of territory, the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip, fell under Israeli control, at least on a temporary basis. Some American Jews object to Israel's control over the West Bank especially. Nobody really wants the Gaza Strip anyway, and the Golan Heights have been annexed to Israel as a matter of security. But the West Bank is a concern, and the controversy continues, although it is highly likely that if there was any kind of really serious conflict that involved the border of Israel itself and the West Bank, that the opposition to Israel would probably be minimized and there would be a high degree of support for Israel. But it's a wedge that has been a concern, and I think most American Jews would approve of a two-state solution if one could be found. Obviously, it's not easy, and all the proposals to create a two-state solution have foundered largely because there is no interlocutor, no person or group that can speak in authoritative terms for all of the West Bank Palestinians. More important even than that is a challenge that has come with the passage of time now that we are in the third generation after the creation of the State of Israel. When Israel was created, people like my parents and myself as a youngster were enthusiastic because we understood the need. Today, Israel is seen as another state among various states, 190 other countries in the world. Israel was originally justified as we will never again allow the massacre of our brethren. Never again. And there was also a tremendous amount of pride in Israel and the determination to support Israel in virtually every way. Those were givens in previous generations. The urgency and the emotional appeal of these rationales for Jewish survival and Israeli survival have dulled. They've dulled with the passage of time. Israel is no longer so universally persuasive, and today we look for alternative rationales for Jewish survival, existence, and flourishing. Now, all of that really sounds sort of negative, and in a sense, I've highlighted some of the issues that are problematic. But there are also positive aspects of Jewish life in America that we ought also to be looking at. One of them is academic recognition. In the 1950s, there were only a few very large universities like Ohio State and Texas that had any kind of coursework on Jewish subjects. A few places had courses dealing with the Hebrew Bible, but they were under the religion department and not taught as Jewish studies courses. And then, of course, there were specifically Jewish colleges, like Brandeis University and Dropsy College in Philadelphia. The rise of ethnic consciousness in the 1960s and 70s caused the creation of specialized programs and departments that dealt with the history and the ideas and the existence of various small groups, and sometimes not so small groups. So, for example, women's studies, something that came about in the 70s and 80s, African American studies, Native American studies, Hispanic studies, and of course, Jewish studies. These were all an affirmation of identity that people had as they went through university and took those courses, usually as electives, occasionally in larger places as a major. The same impetus that led people to want to study women's identity or black identity led to the study of Jewish identity. And this has exposed Jews and non-Jews alike to the history and culture of Jews in America and in the world. And it has led to an understanding and an acceptance that did not exist before that. It has enabled young Jewish adults, especially, to continue learning about their traditions and their heritage, especially since they often did not get an awful lot of that as teenagers in religious schools or in Sunday schools. And often this knowledge evokes pride in their heritage. It's also encouraged a huge publication society of Jewish books. The Jewish Publication Society of America in Philadelphia is only one of them. That was founded by a man we talked about a long time ago, Isaac Leeser, back in the 1840s. But it is one of the preeminent publishers of Jewish books, but there are others as well. And these books are often very influential in helping people come to grips with who they are and what they want to think about and do. The second thing that is a positive is the decline of anti-Semitism. Prior to World War II, surveys indicated that roughly 50% of the American population was willing to affirm that it did not like Jews at some level. It could be privately, it could be in public arenas, but that's a large number. Today the number is under 20%. But even if it's 15% of 300 million people, that's still a lot of people. That's 45 million people, and more or less. Now, most of these folks would never do anything to implement their feelings and their ideas in a public way. First of all, our laws don't permit discrimination in housing or employment or that kind of thing. But beyond that, it has become politically unacceptable, personally unacceptable, socially unacceptable to be prejudiced in public. So some people may go home after work and say some nasty things in their family. that's irrelevant in many ways because it doesn't affect anybody else. A very small number of people belong to hateful groups who actually do something like holding rallies or painting synagogue walls with slogans about Hitler. In my congregation in Dallas in one year, we had 11 attempts by a group of skinheads to cause damage. One Friday night during services, a man in a Nazi uniform ran into services at the back of the synagogue, yelled Heil Hitler, gave the salute, and ran out. On a number of occasions, they spray-painted slogans on the walls. On one occasion, they cut the lines of the air conditioning machine and tried to pour poison into this to simulate the gassing that had happened in the Nazi camps. And on a final occasion, they took a machine gun, a pistol with automatic capability, and fired it through the religious school entrance, causing a great deal of damage. Now, that happened. The good side of it is that every public safety officer in Dallas, and all the way up to the federal government, took this as a personal affront. They had patches on their shoulders that said that were American flags. And they actively said, this kind of behavior is not what our flag stands for. We cannot tolerate it. In addition, the local police officers said, we're sworn to protect and control our neighborhood, and this is out of control. We're not doing this. We're against this. Ultimately, 19 of the skinheads went to federal penitentiary, one for as much as 10 years. But it was a coordinated effort by law enforcement that brought this to a head. In 1955, a sociologist named Will Herberg wrote a book called Protestant Catholic Jew, in which he identified the fact that there are really three large religious identifications or groups in America. Today, we would add Hindu, Muslim, and a number of other Buddhists, a number of other groups in that list. But there remain three large groups, and that affirmed that Jews had arrived in the mainstream. It signified a new status for Jews. Ever since that time, there has been an increasing level of security in this country for Jews, and we are enormously grateful for that. There is a correlated determination to improve the society in which we live. I want to conclude by citing a prayer, in a sense, that the prophet Jeremiah penned from Jerusalem to the exiles of Jerusalem who were living 800 miles away in Babylonia. This was sometime after the destruction of Jerusalem in 587, before the Common Era, and before they returned in 537. So in that 50 years. He wrote a letter to the exiles, and he said in chapter 29 that you should pray for the welfare of the community in which you live, because in that welfare is your welfare as well. You will survive better if the community around you is healthy and thriving. Or, as we say in South Texas, a rising tide raises all boats.